Lots of room. He's 40. Like a rocket. Look at Ginty go. Breaks a tackle. He's 20. He's 10. He's touchdown.
Here's a long run. Oklahoma State gonna do it again, and guess who? Big O to the house.
Milroe gonna run it again. Got a lane. Kicked in the turbo. Milroe. Goodbye. Touchdown, Bama.
Pump fake. Cook. End zone. Caught. Touchdown. Luther Burden the third.
This is the CFF Sites Week 4 College Fantasy Football Show. Welcome in. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF Site. And we are headed into week number 5 now. And I think we really have a good feel of what's going on. And maybe this show might be just brutal honesty, but I feel like we're going to run down a lot of players that, you know, for one reason or another, if they've kind of not hit up until this point, I think we've got enough sample size of most teams to know who's legit, who's for real, and where we may have swung and missed in some drafts, or where we're still really just overly concerned. We're going to get into a lot of names on this week's list. You know, first of all, let me just say this. I mentioned this on last week's show. A lot of bye weeks now. We've got an extra bye week for every team this year. That means there are a lot of teams on buys every week. Your depth is going to be tested, which means that you're going to need more players that are playing regularly now, more so than you have in recent years. So that's one factor that you have to take into account. And then, you know, the injuries, you know, the injury concern. We talk about it every year. This is college fantasy football. There's no mandatory injury report all over, you know, widespread in college football. And you're going to get some late-minute scratches, and that's just what happens. It happens every year, and yet the Discord blows up every season as if this is a new occurrence, and it sucks when it happens to you. I get it. But hopefully your leagues play with some auto-sub feature or a substitute feature, and if not, you have to err on the side of caution. And look, you have to resign yourself sometimes. That's why you just have to err on the side of caution and start guys that you know are just absolutely healthy. I know we're going to get into conversations about Desmond Reed at Pitt, where he was a scratch, and the head coach even mentioned that if he could have played probably if he wanted to. And it's like, yeah, damn, thanks, coach. Where was that news before kickoff? But if you remember, Desmond Reed didn't even finish the game last week. He wasn't on the field for the final drive. So there was a hint that there was something going on. But look, you just don't get any news coming out of college, you know, from colleges like you do in the pro. And it's just one of the headaches that you have to live with. It's normal in the college fantasy football world. It just does not feel good when it happens to you. So there's my take on that. But let's get into discussing week 4, right? And look, let's just kind of start right at the top. Appalachian State. They are a shell of what they were just in years past. There was a number of years where Appalachian State running back 1 was going to be somewhat of a fantasy stud. They just really don't have a run game right now. And they do not look as good as last year. And Joey Aguilar has a while to go before he can kind of catch those touchdown totals from a season ago. I don't feel great about that Appalachian State offense. I think what we've seen is what we're going to get for most of the year. And I think if you've got Joey Aguilar and Caden Robinson, the receivers, you're going to be on the struggle bus a little bit this year. I don't know based on, you know, and here's the tough part. I say this all the time when I'm giving lineup advice. I'm not going to say drop the guy, and I'm not going to say hold them. I'm really just going to try to provide a little insight from my perspective so that you guys can make the decisions that you all have to, because the one thing that I don't know your league specs. I don't know your roster sizes. I don't know all of that. And so I can't just make a hardcore drop given some of those situations. But I can see some leagues with those guys holding, but I also can see, especially Joey Aguilar, I can see where some folks are dropping them too if the league's not real deep that they're in. So take some of these recommendations with a grain of salt, and I would say take into consideration your league size. And look at Syracuse. Look, we were all over Syracuse. Like they were kings of the world. Kyle McCord starting off super fast. All of a sudden knocked back down to earth. They lose at home to Stanford. But I think you guys are okay. They get a home matchup against Holy Cross this week to get things right. But I'm not really worried about Syracuse and that offense. If anything, LaQuint Allen has been the one that's probably the most concerning because Syracuse is passing a heck of a lot more than I think we anticipated in the preseason. Now, a team that's going to run a lot as well is Illinois. We know that they want to run the ball, but Kevin Fegan, those 80, 90-yard games to me just don't look like they're there. He had a decent rushing production against Nebraska this past week, but he had like a 20-yard run in overtime, which really kind of padded those stats a little bit. He finished with 69 yards. I think he had a 21-yard run in overtime. You knocked that out, and he only had 40-something yards in regulation. So I think a concern if you have Kevin Fegan, I can see some owners jumping off of him depending on the size of the league. San Jose State wide receiver Nick Nash continues to just impress. Great story. I love it. But maybe overshadowed a little bit and kind of getting lost in just how good of a season Nick Nash has been having is Emmett Brown, who's been really consistent at the quarterback spot for San Jose State. So definitely worth a look if he's available in your leagues. And then look, sticking in that same matchup, John Mateer, absolute fantasy gold matchup this week with Boise State. I think if anything, some of these matchups over the last couple of weeks have given guys like Josh Meredith to kind of get back on the radar after a couple subpar weeks to start the season. But you're looking at Meredith, you're looking at Kyle Williams, you're looking at Chris Hudson. I mean, those seem to be the big guys. There are some other targets. But with the way Mateer runs the ball, I just don't know if those guys are going to be productive week in and week out. Right now, Maxwell has been the more consistent fantasy option. We'll see how that plays out. Mississippi State quarterback Blake Shapen, which we were high, at least for preseason, on that offense, given Mississippi State's schedule. Blake Shapen out for the year, and that Mississippi team now looks really bad. So I think bad news if you're holding on to wide receivers of Mississippi State. One team that has not looked bad at all, Indiana, right? We referenced in the preseason just how good Indiana's preseason schedule, non-conference schedule looked. And boy, it looked really good. But the one thing that's really interesting about their fantasy production is they have been very, very heavy on the ground. And so as far as the passing game goes, there really aren't any consistent fantasy assets, and that's including Elijah Surratt right now. I can see as Indiana gets into Big Ten play, some folks jumping off of him, jumping off of the Indiana receivers. What I will say is that now that Indiana is getting into conference play, we may not see them spread the ball around as much as they have in non-conference play. But I think Indiana's a little bit better than what I thought they were going to be. They've been pretty dominant in some of these non-conference matchups. I'm really curious to see if they settle into a depth chart that really has more players on the field than others moving forward. North Carolina, Omari and Hampton, two really good games in a row. There were some questions for me in the preseason of why I didn't have him ranked as one of my top 5 backs. My simple answer was, I didn't think North Carolina had a quarterback. I thought that they were going to struggle. And I think that's what's happening right now. Now with this debacle after the James Madison loss, I don't know what's going on at the head coach spot with the things Mac Brown's saying. Really worried about that one getting away from them. Worried for you, Marion Hampton owners. I think there's some great matchups on the schedule, and he's going to be a really good play. You cannot bench him, but I am worried about that North Carolina offense moving forward just because of the consistency at quarterback. And I don't care what you say, Max Johnson, he got hurt in the first game. Yeah, he looked good, but he wasn't the answer either. North Carolina really just doesn't have the quarterback that they're used to having under Mac Brown on the offense. But look, here's the deal. Omarion Hampton is still a stud. You just have to hope that North Carolina can stay in games long enough so that they can use the heck out of him and grind away some fantasy numbers for you. Maryland receiver Ty Felton did what Ty Felton did this past week. I mentioned on last week's show. Looks like a top 10 fantasy receiver to me, and I think he's going to have some good weeks even in Big Ten play. Cade Klubnik continues to stay hot in that Clemson offense. They really dismantled that North Carolina State defense. Ohio State, we finally get into Big Ten play with Ohio State, so I think the better days are ahead for you guys that have Will Howard, the Jeremiah Smiths, Emeka Egbuka. They're going to see more looks this year. That's really scary if you've got some of those players that I just mentioned. Where I really want to see things develop is at the running back spot, because even though Judkins and Henderson have been getting work and both of them have really been productive, I'm just wondering as the season wears on, to me, Judkins looks like the better back. He looks like he's in better favor in Kelly's system. I'm curious to see if Ohio State, as they play in closer games, if Judkins starts to separate himself a bit in the carry volume department. Let's go over to Kentucky, because I'm curious of when Chip Trayanum is going to come back. And now that he's come back and Demi Sumo has had some productive games, now I'm a little nervous if and when he does come back, if those are going to be some split carries, or will Kentucky continue to ride one back? We heard all the talk in camp that Trayanum was going to be the guy. Let's see if he's a difference maker when he returns. I'm assuming he's going to be back any week now. I thought he was only going to miss 3 games, but we're going on 5 weeks now, and he's still not back yet. Just want to throw out Temple receiver Dante Wright has a bunch of targets this year. Just the name that I would throw on your watch list if you need if you need a receiver in a deep FBS leagues. He's been getting targeted quite a lot. They played Utah State. Obviously, Jalen Royals finally had a big game for his fantasy owners. He had a good week 1. He had a good week 4. The thing that's the common denominator is that Spencer Petras was the quarterback for both of those games. Petras was out 2 games. And with Petras, Jalen Royals has had his 2 best games. Now that Petras is back, hopefully that's good news for you guys with Jalen Royals. Iowa State running back Abu Sama was never on the train heavy. I just didn't know who else Iowa State would turn to. The 17 carries for 58 yards against Iowa gave a lot of folks optimism that he'd be really a go-to back. But let's be honest, 7 carries for 30 yards against Arkansas State, coming back off of that performance against Iowa. I'm not feeling it. That's a player I just don't like. I don't think he's going to be consistent all year. I've been off I have 0 shares of Sama. I'd have been off that train early in the season. I just don't think he's it. Jacksonville State. I had a conversation with Mike last week when I was doing projections and spoke about how Tyler Huff and Trey Stewart I felt were 2 gems for the upcoming week. If they continue to get the volume in that Jacksonville State offense, I think you're looking at 2 solid options there, at least if you need some depth at quarterback and running back. Another player off of, if you're holding, I would say get off now, Drake Clark, USM. I know there was some that maybe have taken late flyers with him in deep FBS leagues. That Southern Miss, they look bad. Get off of Drake Clark. Navy, Blake Horvath. I'm sure a lot of folks were ready for me to get to this name. Here's what I would tell you. 12 touchdowns, 5 TD passes, 7 TD runs. I think all came in the last 2 weeks. Oh, here we go. Last 2 weeks, 3 passing TDs, 304 passing yards, seven rushing TDs, 333 rushing yards. This was against Memphis and Temple. I think with that schedule that Navy has, I think Blake Horvath is for real. And ask yourself right now, would you rather have Blake Horvath right now? Would you rather have Kaidon Salter? Would you rather have Blake Horvath right now? Or would you rather have a couple of other quarterbacks that are just kind of sitting there on your bench providing depth? You have possibly a difference maker in Blake Horvath. That's the type of guy that you gamble on the waiver wire to see if you could turn some things around on your roster. Kyron Drones. Okay, would you rather Blake Horvath or Kyron Jones? Here's the thing. I'm not off the train of Kyron Jones. I saw some chatter about him in the Discord. I'm okay with Kyron Jones. They've got wins over Marshall and Old Dominion. They've lost to Vandy and Rutgers. So they're not playing well against good teams. Or just against average teams. But I'm not off the bus with Drones because I think he's still going to get some numbers. I just don't think Virginia Tech is that good. I think they surprised people last year. Remember, I mentioned Syracuse in the same vein that I mentioned they were the Virginia Tech of this year, because last year Virginia Tech kind of snuck up on everybody, didn't know what we're going to get out of that coaching staff. And I'm just wondering if everybody's kind of figured them out. And I think that's where Syracuse is this year. They're coming out, surprise some folks. But I'm not a big fan of Virginia Tech. I don't think they have. I mean, they got Tootin at running back. They have Drones, who I think is an okay quarterback. And I know they got Jennings. They have Lane. They have some decent options. I'm just not sure Virginia Tech's really that good. I mentioned my bid on Desmond Reed at Pitt. Pitt's been an absolute surprise this year. Good for you guys that have any of the Pitt players scooped up on them, particularly running back Desmond Reed and the quarterback Eli Holston. Northern Illinois, right? Go figure this one out. They beat Notre Dame 2 weeks ago in South Bend, coming off of a bye, so they had a week to kind of celebrate and run around naked up around campus. And then they absolutely lay an egg to a terrible. I don't think Buffalo's that good. And now Northern Illinois, I think they have a matchup at NC State this weekend. I'm curious to see how that plays out. Bad loss by Northern Illinois, but look, Ontario Brown is still the guy. There. Go back and listen to my show from 2-3 weeks ago after Notre Dame's loss, when I said they had no choice but to turn Riley Leonard loose. He's only run for 243 yards and 5 TDs in the past 2 games. So things playing out there exactly like I thought that they would. And I believe that Notre Dame's just going to have to continue to pound that run game until they can't pound it anymore, because right now there are just very few options for them in the passing game. Now, let's talk about LSU, because a couple of weeks ago, there were folks jumping on the Kane Durham bandwagon, right, in that performance against South Carolina. LSU just cannot run the ball very good. LSU is a one-dimensional team this year. I happen to think that LSU is not very good. That's going to be really good for fantasy owners of Garrett Nussmeier and Kyron Lacey. But I would not be putting any stock in that LSU run game. Let's go to Southern Cal. Man, I'm still on the fence on USC. Michigan was one of the bets that I had this past week as far as going over on the team total. I didn't think USC's defense was going to hold Michigan down under 20 points. And then USC actually played decent in that game. I think coming out of that game against LSU, I didn't see USC as a top 25 team. I really didn't, because I wasn't impressed by LSU either. I'm starting to change my tune on USC a little bit, but the jury's still out on them for me. And let me tell you why. I know that offense is not as potent as it has been in years past. But that has created a little bit more opportunity for the defense to improve. So I think you've got USC defensive improvement with offense, has kind of taken a step back. USC is still a team for me that I'm on the fence about, but I do like Woody Marks. I mentioned this in the preseason. It may have even been in the preseason draft guide. I know he played over at Mississippi State. For as much utilization that he's got, he's never run for 700 yards, I believe, in a season. And I believe he's already over 300 yards after 3 games. So good for him if you have Woody Marks. I really like him as the most consistent option moving forward in that USC offense. I mean, if you bust 100 yards against Michigan, you're doing pretty good. So good for USC's offensive line and good for you guys that have Woody Marks. Kent State, as we get into the Maction, some folks maybe on high on their receivers, like Flourier and McCray. This is the danger when a team like Kent State plays against Power 5 schools. They go on the road to Tennessee. They go on the road to Penn State. I think they were down to their 3rd string quarterback against Penn State. They only completed 2 passes all game. And now you have to wonder, how beat up is Kent State going into MAC play? And are those receivers even going to be worth having over the next couple of weeks, depending on who starts at quarterback? So some of you guys that have kind of keeping fingers crossed that maybe took a late flyer on McCray, if you're still holding on to him, I still think you've got some worry ahead of you if the Golden Flash's quarterback situation doesn't fix itself in the next week or so. Let's go over to Duke, where this is one of those situations where I mentioned in the preseason, even mentioned in some of the shows throughout, in the season, where sometimes you have 2 backs in a backfield, and sometimes it's only an injury, one player away from being injured before it just completely gives the backfield to someone else. That's what we've seen over at Duke right now, where Star Thomas has taken over as the lead back, with Jaquez Moore on the shelf. I'm not saying that Jaquez Moore is not going to come back, and I'm not saying he's not going to play, because when he does, we may see more of a split backfield. But the coaching staff is getting a really good dose of what they're going to get if they give Star Thomas a heavy workload. And so I'm curious to see how that plays out, but really fortunate situation there for you owners that got Star Thomas and was able to go in and pick him up. And I think we saw the same thing over at Florida State this past weekend, where Lawrence Toafili really took in as the lead back, because you have injuries to Roy Dell Williams, and he had a very productive game. So you have to keep an eye out on those situations where there's 2 backs splitting carries. Sometimes you're only an injury away from one of those guys really, really becoming a stud, right? And that's kind of what's happened a little bit. Look what happened over at Texas. Jaydon Blue was banged up, and then he, all of a sudden now he rests up. You've got some other injuries in the Texas backfield. I think Wisner was a little banged up, and then look, all of a sudden, Jaydon Blue, like gold, fantasy gold, like we thought. Tremendous performance for his fantasy owners this past week in that matchup against Louisiana Monroe. Just absolutely big numbers, right? And then another situation where injuries can really take over. We didn't even mention this yet, but it happened every year. Over at Ohio State, one guy's gone down, it seems like, over the past 2 years. Like, can you imagine having Quinshad Judkins or Trevion Henderson? If one of those 2 guys gets banged up and is on the shelf for 5 or 6 weeks, that is a difference maker, a league difference maker. In a fantasy season, if something like that were to happen. Anyway, I just want to reference that before I get into my Ollie Gordon second talk, because, man, I raised issues of this last week. I made issues of it in my notes and observations, and things are just not getting any better. 3 of his 4 games, he's been under 50 yards receiving. 3 of his 4 under 50 yards rushing. 3 of his 4 touchdowns come against South Dakota State in the first game of the year. They only averaged 3.2 yards per rush against Utah. They are really, really struggling to run the ball. And that's even putting it mildly. LSU has been able to run the ball better than Oklahoma State. Man, I'll tell you what, I do not know, injury aside, if I've ever seen a running back have as good of a year as Ollie Gordon had last year, have as much hype going into this year, and maybe see it crash and burn. And that's bad news for fantasy owners. Now, look, they did play Utah. The competition will get easier, but I mean, guys, let's be honest. I mean, we have seen nothing so far from Ollie Gordon and other in that opener. And let's be honest, the matchups that Oklahoma State has had outside of Utah have not been that bad at all. I was going to try to pull up Oklahoma State's schedule real quick. Let me see if I can catch that. But look, this one's worth taking the time on because it's just South Dakota State, Arkansas, at Tulsa. I mean, just not good. At Kansas State next, they get West Virginia. They go on a bye. 2 road games at BYU, at Baylor. They go on a road to TCU. I just don't know. I'm really worried about Ollie Gordon. Really worried about him. Just a disappointment. And then look at SMU. I mean, look, maybe Ollie Gordon will go full SMU on us, a team and an offense that we were ready to write off as dead, throw up 66 points in a win over TCU. And even with the 66 points, I look at him like, Brashard Smith's still the only guy I want. There's nothing that they did to convince me that there's anybody else that I want on that roster. I mean, was that an indictment on TCU, or was it just, on TCU, or was it just SMU turning the corner? We'll find out. They have Florida State coming up this week. Florida State's defense is solid. Florida State's offense sucks, but their defense is pretty damn good. But look, over at TCU, wide receiver Jack Bech, I mean, against FBS opponents this year has been absolutely lights out. 6 for 139, a touchdown, 9 for 200 and a touchdown, and 8 for 166 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, that's a top 10 receiver in the country right now. Hard to project him outside the top 10 moving forward, given his consistent numbers in his matchups against FBS opponents. Liberty quarterback Kaidon Salter, 4 TD performance. It took a 17-0 deficit and a come-from-behind win for Kaidon Salter to really post those numbers. For those of you that went on the waiver wire to get Billy Lucas, that one was a short. That had a very short shelf life. Quentin Cooley came back, scored a touchdown. So Cooley's back. I think that makes Lucas irrelevant again. You may as well just drop him. He didn't really make it much on your roster that long. But Kaidon Salter, so let's talk about him for a second. I am still not sold on Kaidon Salter that he's back. I think this effort helped. He was I had him projected decently this past week based on the matchup. But my fear is that we're going to need Liberty to fall behind in their matchups for Salter to really, really make good on his fantasy value, because if they're playing from ahead, they're going to keep feeding Quentin Cooley. We have, and maybe the conversation's coming up with South Florida quarterback Byron Brown, which we knew he would not have huge numbers against Miami. And they even have a matchup on the road against Tulane this week that I think might be okay for him, but I don't think it's great. But I mentioned after this week, after this game, I think you're going to see Byron Brown really, really take off. But there's still a little bit with Byron Brown in that South Florida offense, man, where they're just using the hell out of their running backs. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out. But I think Brown's days are ahead of him, and I think he's going to be really good. I don't have the same confidence in Kaidon Salter right now. I know that there's some folks maybe in some full FBS leagues that aren't deep that may have moved on from him already. I'm not ready to throw in that towel because I still think he's good for depth if you're not going to start him. We'll see how that plays out. I'm keeping Kaidon Salter, but we need Liberty to kind of fall behind and really get in some tough games. I'm high on the Toledo offense, have been all year, runs into a bad weather game. They demolished Mississippi State on the road 2 weeks ago. Run into some weather and couldn't handle Western Kentucky on the road. And, nobody from Toledo really had a good game at all. And that's been an offense that's been really good this year. North Texas wide receiver DT Sheffield back on the map after getting blanked against Texas Tech, but now he's got at least 6 catches in all other 3 games, 109 yards and a touchdown this past weekend. He's back on the map. Right now, I'd say he's the guy for North Texas as far as receivers that I'd like to have. I said that 2 weeks ago, and he blanked against Texas Tech, so I hope I'm not jinxing him again. Cal running back Jaden Ott came back against Florida State. So some of those shares of JV and Thomas that are not keeper leagues, I think JV and Thomas has gone the way of Billy Lucas. I don't really think he's going to be that valuable moving forward for you guys, particularly in full FBS leagues. Miami, running back Damian Martinez. I was a big hold on Martinez. 3 TDs against South Florida, but only 31 rushing yards on 11 rushing attempts. That's really interesting because Miami averaged 6.5 yards per carry on the ground against South Florida. Martinez didn't even average 3 yards per carry. I'm still a hold on Martinez because, Miami's going to have to leverage that running game moving forward. And for me, much like USC, even though I'd rather be in Miami's position, and I'd rather be in Miami's position than Michigan, I'm still not like I like Cam Ward. Don't get me wrong. I like Cam Ward, Xavier Restrepo. This is a really, really good team with some good talent. I don't think I would take Miami over Clemson right now. I'm just not sold on Miami as a team. And we have a long way to go. And when you look at the schedule for Miami, at Cal, at Louisville, Florida State, Duke, at Georgia Tech, Wake, at Syracuse, that's really manageable. They don't even play Clemson in the schedule. So, but I wouldn't take them over Clemson right now. But I'm not sold on Miami. Maybe I will be after those road trips to Cal and Louisville to see maybe how they play against a little bit better defenses. But we'll see how that plays out. And I'm certainly look, I'm not knocking any of those Miami assets. I'd like to have them all right now. Speaking of what I'd like to have all of Kaleb Johnson, Iowa running back, 685 yards, 9 touchdowns, 685 yards rushing, 9 touchdowns. Absolutely lights out. He is this year's Ollie Gordon. Like, those are the numbers. The numbers that Kaleb Johnson is posting are the numbers that Ollie Gordon is supposed to be posting this year. Absolute stud, 9 touchdowns, I believe. That's tied for second in the FBS. And of course, RJ Harvey for UCF leads the nation with 10 touchdowns. Bowling Green, tight end Harold Fannin. Here's the numbers and here's the take. Against A&M, against Penn State on the road, 11 catches, 137 yards and a touchdown. On the road at Texas A&M, 8 catches, 145 yards and a touchdown. If that is any indication of what's coming in MAC play, Harold Fannin is going to be an absolute monster. And Bowling Green, I think, is going to be a tough team to beat in the MAC. That's really, I can't believe I'm saying that. But Fannon's putting up wide receiver 1 numbers as a tight end. And the competition's only going to get easier in that conference. Huge weeks ahead of him coming up in MAC play. I'll end with Oklahoma because I'll talk about the quarterback situation there. So I'll skip on over them and just again reiterate Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart, running back Henry Parrish, wide receiver Trey Harris for me is the best fantasy trio in the nation. Texas, I mentioned Jaydon Blue come back. It's 25 carries, 125 yards, score 4 touchdowns. Here comes SEC play. Jaydon Blue, thank you for that breakout game. Boise State, Ashton Jeanty essentially gave him the night off. 11 carries, 120 yards, 127 yards. But you know what? Here's what's disappointing if you have Ashton Jeanty. And that is, you got Travis Hunter getting all the hype. Travis Hunter is one of the best players in college football, if he's not the best, but he is one of the best. I don't think he's going to win the Heisman, but he's up there in early ballots. And look, good for him. He caused the fumble that, made that game swing the other way. And that's the reason why they beat Baylor in overtime, aside from Baylor just playing terrible defense and giving up a Hail Mary. But that play he made is going to go on his highlight reel for Heisman. But if Ashton Genty's going to get the Heisman, Ashton Genty doesn't have big matchups on his schedule the rest of the way. He's going to have to post some really gaudy numbers. And, they were talking about Heisman campaign up in Boise before the season started. And I was just thinking to myself, boy, wouldn't it have been nice for him to have another 300-yard game and another 4 touchdowns? And at the end of the year, if he ends up with like 27 rushing touchdowns, thinking, man, that dude could have had 30 rushing touchdowns at the end of the year. Look, I know beggars can't be choosy. But look, right now, if you're Ashton Genty, or if you really have any hope for him and you're a Boise representative that's really buying into the hype of that he's a Heisman candidate, he's got to roll up as many yards, touchdowns as he possibly can. Let's see what happens this week. Hawaii. I mentioned that, I wasn't sure about Timmy Chang in this offense, and really because of Braden Shager. He was basically only completing a little over 50% of his passes up until this past week. Now, maybe I put the reverse jinx on him, but you saw what happened when he completed this past weekend 81.4% of his passes. They win 36-7. They look like a completely different offense. Now, it was against an FCS opponent, but that's the problem with Hawaii. If Shager's only going to complete 55% of his passes, they're not going to be that good. Just thankfully, Pofeli Ashlock is just the go-to receiver in that offense. He's the one guy that you're going to start every week. Kansas State quarterback Avery Johnson. Let's go there for a second. DJ Giddens. Here's what I would tell you. When I was doing projections this week, because I'm still in the middle of doing them and getting them started, the one thing that really jumped out at me was, one, I don't really feel they're feeding DJ Giddens enough of the ball. I really don't. That he's not getting enough touches in that offense, at least what I feel he should be and where the offense is going to be at its best. He was targeted 10 times in the first 2 games of the year. He's only gotten 1 target in the last 2 games. That's interesting that they're not getting him the ball out of the backfield. Now, I think they need to put the ball in the hands of DJ Giddens a little bit more and take it out of the hands of Avery Johnson a little bit more, particularly throwing the ball. Avery Johnson's one of those guys where I haven't really been on his train at all. I don't have any shares of Avery Johnson, and I can see the raw talent and ability in him. I just don't know if he's going to – I don't know if he's the long-term answer at Kansas State. I'm not feeling Avery Johnson. Maybe I'll miss on him, but I'm just not feeling him as – the solid, efficient, run the offense quarterback that Kansas State is used to having. I think he's in there because he's got raw talent. They see that. They want to maximize it. I just don't know if it's going to happen. He doesn't have that look to me, at least not at this point in his career, or at this point, at least in the season. And then let's just go back to Oklahoma, because here's my feel on Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma got off light. I think Tennessee could have scored a hell of a lot more points. Whether or not Heupel, kind of showed them a little mercy is debatable. Some would argue. What I've noticed leading up to the Tennessee game was that Oklahoma really has not had much on offense besides Jackson Arnold. He's been their most productive player. Deion Burks is probably their best playmaker. And then Michael Hawkins comes in, and everybody's looking for Michael Hawkins to possibly take over as quarterback. And here's what I would say. Be careful what you wish for. There was no motivation for Tennessee to play at the end of that game. That game was done and dusted, and Tennessee had already called off the Dogs. Whether or not Hawkins is better than Arnold remains to be seen. I don't believe it. I just feel that Oklahoma offense does not have the weapons that Seth Luttrell needs, or Seth Luttrell is not the fit for the weapons and the pieces that Oklahoma has on offense. And quite honestly, I kind of feel it's a little bit of both. I don't think the problem's Jackson Arnold. I just don't see Oklahoma having much talent on the offensive side of the ball this year. Their defense is going to keep them in a lot of games, but now that they're going up against some of those SEC offenses, they're going to have to score some points, and they're going to struggle against better competition this year. But I'm not sure Hawkins is the answer. So that's my take on the Oklahoma quarterback situation. And that's a wrap on my week 4 talk in regards to college fantasy football and college football. So that's going to do it for this week's show. A lot of work to get done. A lot of bye weeks again this week. Rosters will be tested, but it's back to the cave to get those projections done for you guys as soon as we can. Mike's going to have all the DFS content. Discord's popping as always, and a place to be on game day so you can get the most up-to-date, up-to-the-minute injury news as it becomes available. You guys in the Discord community are fantastic. You're amazing. Sometimes you kind of go off on a tangent and really take things where they shouldn't, but you know what? It's all fun and games, and I get it. But that's going to do it for this week's show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site. I'll see you guys after week 5.